Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today's going to be a wild ride through history, folks. We're talking dictators.
Dictators!
Yeah, dictators. But not just any dictators. We're going deep into the rise of two of history's most notorious figures, Adolf Hitler and Fidel Castro.
Now, those are two names that still send chills down the spine. But what could these two possibly have in common? They were practically ideological opposites.
You're right, they were worlds apart in their beliefs. But that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating, right? We're using this history podcast episode as our guide, and it does a fantastic job, by the way, of showing how two completely different contexts, like Germany after World War I and Cuba under Batista, could somehow produce strikingly similar outcomes.
Well, you know what they say? History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes.
And boy, does it rhyme in this case. So let's set the stage. We'll start with Weimar Germany. The podcast really paints a vivid picture of just how chaotic things were. Imagine Germany, utterly defeated in World War I, forced to accept blame and crippling reparations with the Treaty of Versailles. Talk about a recipe for disaster.
And on top of that, you've got this economic turmoil that's just off the charts. Widespread unemployment, hyperinflation so bad that people were literally carrying wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread.
It's mind-boggling.
That was a night.
And then, as if things couldn't get any worse, enters the stab-in-the-back myth. This idea that Germany was betrayed from within by its own government and civilians during the war.
Oh, absolutely. And that myth, it was incredibly damaging. Talk about psychological warfare, right?
It's like pouring gasoline on an already raging fire.
Exactly. It created this breeding ground for extremist groups, like the Nazis, to exploit people's fears and frustrations.
They're basically offering a scapegoat, someone to blame for all of Germany's problems.
Right. And it's a simple narrative, very easy to grasp in times of chaos and uncertainty. We didn't lose the war. We were betrayed by those who wanted to profit from our demise.
It's scary how effective that kind of rhetoric can be. And just when you think things couldn't get any worse, bam, the Great Depression hits.
Talk about a 1-2 punch. Germany was already on its knees, and then this global economic crisis sends unemployment skyrocketing, businesses collapsing left and right. People were desperate for solutions, desperate for someone to lead them out of the darkness.
And lurking in the shadows was, well, Hitler.
A master propagandist, let's not forget. He understood the power of imagery, of repetition, of appealing to raw emotion. Rallies, posters, radio broadcasts, you name it, he used it.
And what was his message exactly? What was he promising?
Restoration. He promised to rebuild a strong, proud Germany, to purge it of weakness, to punish those he deemed responsible for its downfall. He tapped into that existing resentment, that humiliation from the war, and offered a path back to greatness.
So basically, a very seductive promise for a nation that's already hurting.
It's a tale as old as time. Create a crisis, or at least amplify an existing one, then position yourself as the only one who can solve it.
Classic power play. Okay, so we've got Germany, primed for a charismatic leader to step in and exploit all this chaos. But what about Cuba? That seems like a completely different story, right?
On the surface, sure. But when you dig a little deeper, you start to hear those historical rhymes again. See, Cuba at this time, although technically independent, was heavily influenced, you could even say dominated, by the United States. We're talking about the Platt Amendment, which basically gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it saw fit.
So it's like having Big Brother watching over your shoulder constantly.
And intervening, economically, militarily. It created this deep resentment among Cubans, this feeling of being controlled by a foreign power, a breeding ground for revolution, some might say.
And that's where Fulgencio Batista enters the picture, right?
Exactly. Batista, a military officer, he stages a coup in 1952, promising stability and prosperity. But what does he actually deliver? Corruption, inequality, a brutal crackdown on any opposition. Does any of this sound familiar?
It does, actually. It's eerily similar to what was happening in Germany. Both countries are like simmering cauldrons of resentment, one fueled by defeat and economic collapse, the other by foreign influence and a repressive regime. And as we'll see in a bit, it's in these crucibles of discontent that figures like Hitler and Castro find their moment.
So we've got these two nations right on the edge, practically begging for someone to take charge. But Hitler and Castro, I mean, they couldn't have been more different, could they? How do their paths to power actually play out?
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting. You see, Hitler, he was a master manipulator. He played the system, the very system he claimed to despise, to his advantage.
So no storming the Bastille for him. He wasn't leading a revolution from day one. Not quite. Think of it more like a hostile takeover from within. He starts by getting a foothold in the Reichstag, the German parliament. Remember, the Nazi Party, they weren't always this massive force. They started small, targeting their message to those who were hit hardest by the economic crisis, the unemployed, the disillusioned.
So appealing to the frustrated masses, those who feel like the system has failed them. But he had help along the way, didn't he? Weren't there powerful people who thought they could use Hitler for their own ends?
Oh, absolutely. The podcast talks about this guy, Franz von Papen, a conservative politician who actually saw Hitler as a useful idiot, someone he could manipulate. There's this chilling quote from a letter Papen wrote to President Hindenburg where he basically says, and I'm paraphrasing here, "We've hired him."
Hired him, as if Hitler were some sort of political intern. What an epic miscalculation. They thought they could control him, that he would play by their rules.
Talk about misreading the room. And the consequences, well, we know how that turned out.
And while all of this is happening in Germany, you have Fidel Castro in Cuba, a young lawyer, advocating for, get this, democratic reform.
Yeah, Castro's early career is pretty surprising. He wasn't always about armed revolution. Initially, he really believed in working within the existing system to create change.
So completely different from Hitler's approach.
Totally. But then Batista stages his coup in 1952, and that's the game changer for Castro. Any hope for peaceful reform, it's out the window.
So that's when Castro goes full revolutionary.
Pretty much. In 1953, he leads this incredibly audacious but ultimately unsuccessful attack on the Moncada barracks, a military base. Now, the attack itself was a flop, but it catapulted Castro into the spotlight. People started to see him as this defiant symbol of resistance against Batista's regime.
And that's where his famous "History will absolve me" speech comes in.
You got it. So Castro is captured, he's put on trial for the Moncada attack, and he uses the courtroom as his stage. We're talking about this electrifying 4-hour speech. He lays out his vision for Cuba. A Cuba free from corruption, free from foreign influence. He rails against Batista's excesses about social justice, about national sovereignty. It's a powerful, powerful speech.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
It's amazing, this power that words can have, how they can inspire, incite, even change the course of history. So this speech, I'm guessing it becomes a rallying cry for the Cuban Revolution.
Absolutely. The podcast really emphasizes this point, that it was a turning point, not just for Castro personally, but for the entire revolutionary movement.
Okay, so Castro is solidifying his image as a revolutionary leader. Meanwhile, back in Germany, Hitler is consolidating his power through some pretty cunning and terrifying tactics, right? The Reichstag fire in 1933 comes to mind.
Yeah, that's a big one. So out of nowhere, the Reichstag building, the German parliament, goes up in flames.
Spontaneous combustion? I don't think so.
Right, convenient timing, to say the least. And of course, the Nazis immediately blame the communists. No evidence, but hey, who needs evidence when you've got fear on your side?
Classic move. Create a crisis and then point the finger at your enemies.
It worked like a charm. The fire created this climate of fear, of paranoia, and Hitler used it brilliantly to push through the Enabling Act.
In the Enabling Act, this is basically what gives Hitler dictatorial powers.
Pretty much.
Right.
It allowed him to bypass the Reichstag, to pass laws without their consent, and to silence any opposition.
So it's goodbye democracy, hello dictatorship.
It's terrifying how quickly a democracy can crumble when fear takes hold. And the Nazis didn't stop there. You've got the Night of the Long Knives, a purge of Hitler's own party members who he saw as a threat. Brutal doesn't even begin to describe it.
It's a chilling reminder that power corrupts. So while all of this is going down in Germany, Castro is waging his revolution in the jungles of Cuba, right?
Yeah.
He's got Che Guevara by his side. It's all very dramatic.
Straight out of a movie. So after his release from prison, Castro flees to Mexico, regroups, and forms a guerrilla army.
So we've got our classic image of Castro, Che Guevara, those iconic beards, hiding out in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, plotting the revolution.
And those images weren't just for show. They were incredibly strategic. Castro understood the power of optics, how a single photograph could sway public opinion. The diaries of Che Guevara, which are mentioned in the podcast, they offer this incredible first-hand account of the guerrilla campaign, the tactics they used, their struggles, their victories.
It sounds like required reading for any history buff. So Hitler in Germany, Castro in Cuba, two very different men, two very different contexts, but both tapping into this deep well of discontent. It makes you wonder, are there any universal truths to be found in their stories?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And luckily for us, that's exactly what we'll be unpacking in our next deep dive. Stay tuned.
It really makes you think, right? How did these two guys, worlds apart in so many ways, manage to tap into that same vein of discontent? Was any of this, I don't know, inevitable? Could things have gone differently? It's a lot to unpack.
The million-dollar question. And the podcast, to its credit, doesn't shy away from those big questions. It dives right into the different schools of thought surrounding the rise of dictators. Gets pretty academic, but in a good way, you know.
Love a good history debate. So what are the main schools of thought, the different camps, when it comes to understanding how figures like Hitler and Castro came to power?
Well, with Hitler, you've got two main camps, two perspectives that are always going head-to-head. You've got the Intentionalists and the Structuralists.
Okay, Intentionalists versus Structuralists. I'm intrigued. Break it down for me. Who are these guys and what do they argue?
All right, so the Intentionalists, they're all about Hitler himself. They emphasize his agency, his personality, his charisma, his ruthlessness. They argue that his rise to power was a direct result of his own actions, his own brilliant, albeit twisted, strategies.
So it's the Hitler was destined for greatness, or at least for dictatorship argument.
Exactly. They point to his mastery of propaganda, how he exploited every crisis, how he manipulated the masses, and they argue that he was pulling the strings the whole time. Even without those favorable conditions, the Treaty of Versailles, the economic depression, they say Hitler would have found a way.
Wow, so they're putting it all on Hitler, the man, the myth, the monster. What about the Structuralists? Where do they stand on all of this?
The Structuralists, they're all about context. They say, hold on a minute, let's not give Hitler all the credit here. They emphasize the historical circumstances, the political and economic turmoil in Germany that created the perfect breeding ground for someone like Hitler to rise.
So they're saying he was a product of his time, that anyone in his position could have done the same.
In a nutshell, yes. They argue that the Weimar Republic, it was deeply flawed from the start. It was weak, unstable, and vulnerable to extremism.
So are they saying Hitler was inevitable?
Some might go that far. They'd say that even without Hitler, Germany was headed down a dark path. It's a chicken or the egg debate, isn't it? Did Hitler create the conditions, or did he simply capitalize on them?
Fascinating stuff. So we've got the Intentionalists versus the Structuralists in the Hitler corner. What about Castro? Are there similar debates about his rise to power?
Oh, absolutely. With Castro, it often comes down to internal versus external factors. You have historians who focus on the internal dynamics of Cuba, the corruption under Batista, the poverty, the inequality, the desire for change.
So they're saying Castro's revolution was a purely Cuban affair driven by homegrown issues.
Exactly. They argue that Batista created his own demise. He was corrupt, he was brutal, and he pushed the Cuban people too far. Castro, they say, was simply the right man in the right place at the right time to lead the charge.
Okay, that makes sense. But there's always another side of the story, right?
Right. And on the flip side, you have historians who point to U.S. imperialism as a key factor in the Cuban Revolution. They argue that you can't understand Castro's rise without understanding the long history of U.S. intervention in Cuba.
So it's more nuanced than just Castro good, Batista bad.
Much more nuanced. This camp emphasizes the economic control the U.S. exerted over Cuba, the political meddling, the support for Batista even as he became increasingly repressive. They argue that Castro's revolution wasn't just about ousting a dictator, it was about national liberation, about breaking free from the grip of a superpower.
It's amazing how two very different interpretations can both have valid points. I guess that's what makes history so interesting, right? There are always multiple perspectives to consider.
Absolutely. And that's what we should all take away from this deep dive. It's not about passing judgment from a distance, but about trying to understand the complexities of the past.
It's about asking the tough questions, considering different perspectives, and acknowledging that there are rarely easy answers. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap things up. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the ashes of World War I to the jungles of Cuba. We've explored the historical context, the political maneuvering, the different schools of thought surrounding the rise of these two infamous dictators. What a ride.
It really makes you think.
It does. And if you're looking to delve even deeper into this fascinating, albeit sobering chapter of history, I highly recommend checking out the primary sources mentioned in the podcast. Castro's History Will Absolve Me. Speech is a must-read.
Absolutely. And for a truly chilling experience, take a look at some of those letters between von Papen and Hindenburg. Talk about miscalculations.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and most importantly, never stop learning from the past.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.